So when users switch from Windows to Mac, one of the problems they have is adjusting to the new keyboard shortcuts. Mac has some different keyboard shortcuts than Windows. They're similar though, which sometimes makes it even more difficult because the differences are subtle. For instance, let's start by looking at the basics of copy, cut, and paste. Copy on Windows is Control-C. And on Mac it's almost the same thing. It's Command-C. Let's look at what the difference is. If you look at the Mac keyboard you'll see here that you've got four modifier keys. The Shift key, Control key, Option key, and Command key. So you see there's a Control key there. So right away you think, okay, just like on Windows, Control-C. But on Mac the primary modifier key is Command, not Control like Windows. So in fact most keyboard shortcuts on Windows that are Control plus a letter are actually Command plus a letter on Mac. So instead of Control-C for copy it's Command-C. Control is kind of a secondary modifier key. It's not as important as Command. Most things use Command for modifier. So if I were to select some text here and want to copy it and paste it I would use Command-C and then Command-V to paste. And if I wanted to cut it I would use Command-X and then Command-V to paste. Likewise if I want to select all, instead of Control-A it's Command-A. And if I were to make a mistake, say delete everything, I would use Command-Z rather than Control-Z to undo. Undo is kind of interesting because there's also a redo command that's typically available. So for instance if I type some new text and then I delete it and I Command-Z to undo and then I realize I want to redo what I just undid. On Windows very often it's Control-Y, but on Mac it's not Command-Y, it's actually Command-Shift-Z. So the Shift kind of reverses the Command-Z to make it a redo. Now this varies by app. So here in Pages I can see that undo typing is Command-Z and redo is Shift Command-Z. However some apps, like for instance Adobe apps, still use Command-Y for redo. So you can always check for any keyboard shortcut by going into the menu and then looking on the right side and seeing everything that's there. Like for instance select all, there's Command-A. And notice it uses the symbol on the Command key rather than the word Command. So let's look at some other keyboard shortcuts that are different Windows to Mac. So one is using the F1 key to access help. Now that doesn't work on Mac but you do have this help menu up here and you can click it and get to different help things there. A keyboard shortcut that always works to bring up the help menu is Command-Shift/. And that's easy to remember because the slash key, the shift on that is the question mark. So you're kind of doing Command question mark, Command-Shift/, and then you can immediately start typing for getting help on something specific or looking for a menu item, or you can down arrow right to one of these documents or windows that will pop up and hit return to bring it up. Another one you may find is that on Windows you use Alt and Tab to go between apps. On Mac it's Command Tab. So that's a little different there because typically you would go Control to Command but here you're going Alt to Command. So you can Command Tab to go between apps. So another one is using Alt F4 to close something in Windows. Close the window, close the app. On Mac you do various different things depending on which one you want. So for instance to close a current window that's open you would use Command-W. And that closes, say if you have 3 Pages documents open, it closes the frontmost one. If you have 1 Pages document open it closes that window but Pages is still running. If you want to quit the app then typically you use Command-Q. And this could vary by app but typically it's Command-W for close, Command-Q for quitting an app. So another popular command I see on Windows is using F2 to rename a file. You don't need to do that on Mac. All you need to do is select the file and you can click in the file name after it's selected and now you're in edit mode. You can edit the file name. Another quick way to get there is hit the return key and it immediately goes into edit mode for the file name for the file that's selected. Note that there's a key on your Mac keyboard that's labeled Option, and on many versions of the Mac keyboard also you see the word Alt there. On Windows systems you always refer to this as the Alt key, alternate key. On Mac you refer to it as the Option key, but they are in fact the same key, so sometimes you see people say one or the other. Now probably the most famous keyboard shortcut on Windows is Control-Alt-Delete to be able to force quit an app. Same thing on the Mac except it's Command, Option, and Escape. And that brings up this window here which allows you to switch to an app or force quit an app by selecting it and pressing the force quit button.